Welcome to Lights and Shadows. Creating shadows in TouchDesigner takes a few extra steps when setting up our render network, so let's quickly run through how we can get started. Let's start by opening up the Create dialog and heading over to Components. We're going to need a few pieces here to get started. So let's hold down the Control key and add a camera and a null. And let's also go ahead and add a light and a null. We're going to want those for both of those. Let's close the Create dialog. I'm going to move my camera and null over to the side. And I'm going to grab my light and my null and move them over to the side here. It's going to be useful for us to see our geometry viewer at the same time. So let's split our view. And on the right hand side, let's change that to geometry viewer. Excellent. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start by making sure that my camera is using my null 1 as its look at. And for my light, I'm going to use null 2 as a look at. It's going to be easier for us to kind of position some elements here spatially if we're using lookats in this particular configuration. Now we need a few pieces of geometry here in our network to get started. So let's head over to surface operators and let's add a box SOP to our network. And let's also add a rectangle SOP to our network. Now I'm going to right click on the output of the rectangle as where I'm going to get started, head over to components and make sure that I connect that to a piece of geometry. I'm going to change the orientation of my rectangle SOP to be in the ZX position instead of the XY. And I'm going to change its size to be 10 by 10. So you can kind of see that arranged here. Next, I'm going to go ahead and give this a material. So I'm going to head over to the material family and add a Fong material. And let's drag the Fong right on top of our geometry and assign it as a material. Next, let's give it a diffuse color, maybe like a dark blue here. And we can close a color picker. And now let's right click on the output of our box. Also head over to the component family, create a geometry component for our box component. I'm going to take this Fong and copy paste it. I'm going to drag Fong 2 right on top of geometry 2 and assign that as a material. Next, I'm going to head back to this Fong 2 and I'm going to change its diffuse color to say orange so you have a way to kind of see it stand out. Last but not least, I think what I want to do is I want to pull this box here up so it sits on the surface of this plane. So let's head back to the box SOP and let's make sure that its center is 0.5 here above our surface. So it's sitting right on top of our plane here, of our rectangle. Excellent. Okay, now let's add a render top here into our network. And I'm going to go ahead and make that the background viewer. Now, from this vantage point, if I back out here in my geometry viewer, I can see that sure enough, I'm looking right along the edge of this rectangle SOP. So let's head back to our camera and let's transform this up slightly. And let's maybe move here to the right a little bit. And now we can see if I hit the P key to close a parameter window, I have a kind of better vantage point to view our scene. Now, I can tell already that I have a light that's positioned here back along the Z-axis, but I'd really like to change its position slightly. So I'm going to move it up here in Y slightly. That's better. And I think I'm going to move it a little closer, say 5. Now, this is interesting, but not quite right just yet. And that's partially because if I head over to the light page, I'll notice that this is currently configured as a point light. Let's change this to be a cone light. Excellent. I like that. Let's turn up the cone angle slightly so we can kind of better see a little more of what's happening here. This is looking pretty good. And next, let's head over to shadows. Now, by default, shadows are turned off. So let's go ahead and change this parameter to be soft 2D mapped. And already we're starting to see some shadows show up. Now I can see it doesn't look too great back there just yet, and that's all right. Let's go ahead and change the position of our light just a little bit. I'm going to head over to the Xform page and I'm going to pull us up a little bit more. There we go. So now we've got our light positioned. We've got a nice little shadow here set up, and we have the beginning of what it takes to configure our scene so we can actually use shadows here when we're doing a rendering. One piece that's worth noting is that in order for our light to cast shadows, it needs to actually be able to see all of the objects that are casting shadows inside of the scene or inside of our network. If we head over to the shadow page, we'll see here that we have a shadow caster's parameter. And this lets us specify which operators or which components are going to be used to cast shadows. An asterisk in this parameter means that all of our geometry components are going to be used to cast shadows in this particular portion of our network. If we wanted to have a better sense of what our light could see, we could use a depth top here. So let's add a depth top to our network. Let's drag the light onto our depth top. Let's change our pixel format to be 8-bit. Change our depth space to be rearranged from camera space. And now if we reposition our light here, for example, let's translate it here over to the right, we can see we have a better sense of where the kind of boundaries of what our light can see. This is really helpful for us to ensure that we understand the bounds that are in the view of our light and what we can actually cast shadows on, or what can be used for casting shadows. This is just the beginning of how we can start to think about how to use shadows here inside of TouchDesigner and how we set up our networks to do that. And hopefully this gives you some ideas that you can take advantage of.